Do you agree with Secretary Kerry's decision basically to push aside the fact that while these talks were going on, the Iranians were opposing U.S. interests in other countries in the region, such as Iraq, Yemen, and most importantly, Syria?
But it wasn't Secretary Kerry alone. Secretary Powell, Secretary Rice, Secretary Clinton, and Secretary Kerry have all agreed that the nuclear question is the most important issue with Iran. And because they did not want to be diverted from working on the nuclear question by other issues, they were the ones who insisted to the Iranians that we would solve the nuclear question first and foremost without being diverted to other issues, feeling that the Iranians might want to give importance to other questions as a way of continuing their nuclear program and obviously move toward a concern we had that they were secretly going to build a nuclear weapon behind our backs. I think that your question takes the opposite point of view now. And I think it's a good question because it shows that, in effect, we have more differences with Iran over other issues that we have to attend to, and that there ought to be strategic thought given to how, as we move ahead with the nuclear question and solve that issue, and I hope we will, that we can then turn to questions like Afghanistan and Iraq and even Syria, where we have some common agreement.
You've worked for 12 different presidents, we counted them before we started this interview, and even more secretaries of state. Now I'm going to ask you a tough question. Who was your best boss?
It's hard to say. I thought that a number of presidents were in the areas where I worked in foreign affairs. President Kennedy was groundbreaking in many ways. President Nixon, in his own way, with the opening to China, despite the fact that there were difficulties there. I watched President Clinton, who had an enormous capacity to work with foreigners. My own sense was that those three, perhaps, were, on the presidential side, ones that you would want to look at very carefully. I worked closely for a while with Secretary Kissinger, and he's an amazing person. And I also did with Secretary Shultz, and I thought he was a very capable person. I worked with Secretary Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and have a great deal of admiration for Secretary Powell, and thought he did a lot of very, very useful work in the State Department, and similarly with Secretary Clinton. I think we shouldn't talk about secretaries now in office, although I have to tell you I admire what Secretary Kerry has started to do in the Middle East, in the Arab-Israeli peace question, in giving tremendous attention to Iran, about which we've been talking, but also working very hard on Syria and now on Iraq. And he has, in many ways, I think, shown that someone who is willing to take risks, not lightly and not blithely, but clearly to accept risks, can perhaps help move questions ahead rather than walking away from them because they're a little too dangerous.
One of our senators here in Colorado has signed on as a co-sponsor of the Senate bill calling for more sanctions. Can you explain why he might have done that?
Well, I think that's really his business. And as a diplomat, I learned that discussions of domestic politics in most countries by foreign diplomats was rejected. And I think probably as a visitor to Colorado, I should leave to the senator his own thoughts on that particular question. I'd be very interested to know because I think the bill needs to be read with great care, and it's a very complicated bill. I have, within the last 2 hours, just reviewed the bill in detail, and I have to tell you that the bill, despite the promises of the sponsors, that it is supporting President Obama's negotiating effort, it is not the case. It appears very clearly the bill imposes sanctions now and then gives the president very limited waiver authority and then adopts a clause which will allow the Congress to override that waiver authority on the basis of a wide number of grounds, and that the waiver authority is limited and that the president has very strict reporting requirements. So the president is put in a cage and in many ways is given impossibly difficult goals to achieve as part of the future negotiations. Otherwise, the sanctions will stay in force or be reinvigorated. And I think that the purpose, therefore, of the bill, in all honesty, is clearly going to undo the work that has already been done and make impossible the work that has to be done ahead if we're going to take advantage of the negotiating route. And if we don't take the advantage of the negotiating route, I have to tell you, I see only two alternatives on the table. That there'll be a war, or we may have to live with Iran with a nuclear weapon. And neither of those, in my view, is a very appetizing alternative. And it bothers me that seemingly good men in the Senate have put aside or cast aside those views. And I wish and hope they would reread what they're co-sponsoring, because it bothers me.
I wondered if you could just say a word about the UN, the United Nations, its role in the world, its future, your views as former U.S. ambassador to the UN.
I'll say two things about the United Nations. The United Nations comes in for a lot of criticism. Some of it deserved and some of it not deserved. Some of it corrected and some of it that still needs to be corrected. I think that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is determined to continue, as his predecessors did, to correct it. The United Nations provides us a unique opportunity in foreign policy at two ends of the spectrum. One which almost no one thinks about is that we could not fly safely internationally. We could not operate the internet. We could not have real progress in world health. We could not do 1,000,001 things if we did not have treaties and small organizations as part of the United Nations to carry out all of those functions. So if it wasn't there just to exist, we would have to invent all of those arrangements. Everything from meteorology to maritime to postal to banking. That's at the other end, and that's never thought about. But it's something the United Nations brings to us, and it is very important. At the upper end, peace and security is fundamental. The United Nations Security Council is not perfect, but it is the one organization that gives legitimacy up to, if necessary, using force to deal with threats to international peace and security. It seeks to deal with those first through other measures, including sanctions, including diplomacy, including lots of other steps. But there is, within the United Nations Charter, the right to use force if the Security Council approves it. It gives the U.S. a veto, so we remain absolutely pristine of any influence by the Security Council. We have a very unique, very favorable position. Of course, it gives other countries vetoes, so they don't have to go along with us. And that's a problem for our diplomacy, but we have to persuade in those cases that we have the right solution. I was in the United Nations back in 1990 when we persuaded the other members of the Security Council that the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a breach of peace and security, a violation of international law, and that we should get an authority to use force, which we did, in order to rectify that egregious wrong.
What do you have to say to young people who might be looking at a diplomatic career?
Well, I would say that I welcome their interest. It's a fascinating career. The rewards are not monetary, but in some ways they're psychic and they're realistic. I always found that there were a couple of things that made a difference. The ability to participate as one person in a series of activities and actions that help to put together, strengthen, and indeed improve American foreign policy. It's a really unique position, and you as an individual can make a real contribution to that. Of course, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat only one. The second is that you, at the other end of the spectrum, have an interesting opportunity to help Americans who are often in trouble overseas, sometimes through no fault of their own. And so your ability to help your fellow citizens, many people lost, bewildered, uncertain as to what's happening to them, depend very heavily on our officers overseas in the consulates and embassies of the United States to take an interest in their cases and to seek to find ways to relieve whatever suffering it may be, whether it is a health issue, an arrest issue, a violation of local law issue, and so on. And these are all very important things because for Americans who travel overseas by the millions every year, the notion that their government stands with them and is prepared to help them is a very important reassurance. And of course, the world's most powerful country, and it still is, being able to speak quietly but firmly with foreign governments on these issues is an important aspect of the work.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for being with us today and for all the work that you have done and will continue to do on behalf of our country.
Thank you, Karen, for the opportunity to be here.